to say I'm going to introduce our speaker. So we are very excited to have Julie Britton with us. Julie has a long history of social justice and liberal do-gooding starting in the 90s, and has worked as the development director and operations specialist with the West Virginia Coalition for People with HIV and AIDS. She's also been the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS and Emergency Solutions grant specialist through the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity. Has worked as a victims advocate for the Division of Corrections, and been the program director of the YWCA of Charleston Resolve Family Abuse Program, and has been with them for 4 years. In the past 4 years, Resolve has dynamically changed the way domestic violence services are provided, by also serving men in the shelter, adding a pet shelter for the survivors' animals, and starting a pilot project that allows survivors to apply for domestic violence petitions and attend the follow-up hearing and avoid them being in the same courtroom as the abuser. So a lot of cool initiatives. Julie is a graduate of West Virginia State University and has a bachelor's in sociology. She's a member of the board of directors of the West Virginia Coalition Against Domestic Violence and is on the leadership team, and has been recognized for her work with the West Virginians with HIV/AIDS during a national conference in Washington, D.C. She's a lifelong learner, questioner of the status quo, and a somewhat extroverted introvert. She lives in South Charleston with her son Trip, 2 dogs, Dexter and Tucker, and Catechus Finch. That's great. So welcome, Julie. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you for the seminar, and we're excited to hear your presentation.
Hi, I'm so sorry you had to read all of that. It didn't seem that long when I put it together. And oh wow, I am super excited to see everyone here. I saw 140 participants. So, I'm taking some deep breaths because I love to talk about what we do. And I don't know if I've ever done it to a group this large before. So, we're all in it together for the next hour, you guys. So this will be great. I do want to say that there are some really hot button topics that absolutely may trigger some people. When I've done this presentation before, I've had people come up to me afterwards and say, oh my gosh, you explained exactly what my life was like. So just know that might happen. So I just wanted to let people know ahead of time before we jump right in. So I have timed this. It usually comes out with questions to be right at about an hour and 5 or 10 minutes. I do talk fast. So please, if I'm going too fast, I will never recognize that, as it's just my set. So please check in with through the chat and let me know you need me to slow down. So this is a really generic domestic violence 101, but we're going to really have some conversations about what survivors wish you knew. So the purpose of this, and I do before I start this, because it's being recorded, it's going to give those of you who are in this training a much better overview than if you just had the PowerPoint. So there's going to be part of this that's missing. I'm a huge proponent of not reading PowerPoint slides to people, but since I knew we'd be sharing this with people who may just only get the PowerPoint, there is going to be a lot of that same information, but I'm using it in many places to also bounce off of. So I hope no one's sitting there like, is this woman seriously reading every one of these slides to us? Like, that's absolutely not my goal, but it might happen in a couple things. So the purpose of this is to discuss the dynamics of domestic violence. And those of you on here are going to learn about the various types of domestic violence and some reasons behind what starts that abusive behavior. and especially why it's so difficult for victims to leave. We're also going to delve into how we can start changing that narrative about the inherent questions that so many people ask victims and survivors that are truly victim blaming, how we can change that script. So I now have, roughly 140 of you that can start this with us to change that onus of shame. So the final part, I'm just going to do a quick run through about what we do here at the YWCA of Charleston. And I've got some slideshow, some pictures of our pet project, because it's my absolute favorite thing. Well, we do a lot of great things, but that's the one thing that was like my absolute number one goal when I started. So you'll get to see a little bit of our pet project. Our objectives, everybody's going to be able to define domestic violence and identify like the core reasons why it starts. You'll know the different types of abuse. You'll understand why some people stay. You'll be able to discuss the dynamics of abuse. We're going to bust some myths about domestic violence, and then you'll know more about what Resolve does. And for those of you in Kanawha, Boone, and Clay County here, you'll know where and how to refer somebody for assistance. Hopefully that won't be you, but I can almost guarantee you that someone you know or someone you work with will need our crisis chat or our hotline number. And that's incredibly unfortunate, but it's the truth of what we do. So domestic violence isn't just a physical assault. It's a variety of behaviors that center on one partner having power and control. Those two words, power and control over their partner. And I do want to have a caveat to this. Absolutely, we do see male victims and survivors of domestic violence, but currently it is still females are 95% of the victims. So when I refer to victims and survivors, I will default to she. Until that changes in this society, that's the way that I'm going to continue forward. It's not to negate what happens to male victims of domestic violence, but yeah, it's the truth of what we see. So it's not all physical. It's also psychological, emotional, economic, legal, threats about children and pets, intimidation, isolation on purpose to make sure no one has a support system, coercion, financial control, and many, many other behaviors, which are absolutely used on purpose and by choice by the perpetrator to control their victim. And this is much different from just a physical assault on a stranger that might happen out at a bar. This is a pattern of conduct. It's not a one-off event. And when we talk about domestic violence, it can be family, it can be intimate partners, and sometimes it's friends. So there's two different kinds of domestic violence that we see most often with what we do here at Resolve. And there is the intimate partner violence, which I think is going to be most people's go-to, like that's going to click for those of you. It's current and former spouses, dating couples. You may or may not have a child in common. It occurs equally in heterosexual and same-sex couples. And it doesn't mean that you are having sexual intimacy. It can vary in frequency and severity. So this could be,
I guess it's Lisa.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing a question. So, and it occurs on a continuum, but not all together. So it's not an everyday thing sometimes. And it may be just a couple of times a year, but it's still domestic violence. But domestic violence also includes familial violence, So especially we see this in our 3 counties. So we serve Kanawha, Boone, and Clay, and each of those counties is incredibly different. In Kanawha County, we see more intimate partner violence, a little bit of familial violence. I mean, it's still a lot of domestic violence, and we have staff at the courthouse that help with this. We'll talk more about it later. But for instance, in Boone County, we predominantly see more interfamily violence. Grandparents who are taking care of grandkids, and now the grandkids are in active substance use disorder and are financially and physically violent with their family members. And in Clay County, we see mostly just intimate partner violence. So that's at the courthouse. That's not to say that that is an actual true picture of what's happening in the entire county. Those are the people, though, that come to us for assistance. So, and so here's one thing. Domestic violence isn't just affecting the actual victim, but it's family members, it's friends, it's coworkers, and it's absolutely the community at large. Domestic violence is hugely expensive for the court system to deal with, for the overarching judicial system, and not to mention the hospital system. So frequent exposure to domestic violence in the home teaches kids that violence is a normal way of life. And it absolutely increases the risk of children becoming the next generation of abusers. There is so much information out there about this, about what it's like growing up in an abusive home, and what it does to young girls and what it does to young men. And at Shelter, we see this. We absolutely, we see the effects of domestic violence on children in so many different ways, but the most heartbreaking, I think, is when we get a young male child who comes in with his mother and he's 8 years old, and he's talking to and treating his mother the way that he's seen his father. And it's incredibly disturbing to see an 8-year-old in that abusive role. So domestic violence is absolutely, it's incredibly complex. It's absolutely different. And just like anything else, it's situational and it changes from person to person. But absolutely, witnessing violence between parents is the strongest risk of continuing this violence from one generation to the next. Media portrayals do have a part in this. You know, violent and highly sexualized interactions between partners has become sort of the go-to in media, whether it's video games or movies. It's just a small piece of this, but it's absolutely a piece of it. And so it's really important to understand this is never the victim or survivor's fault, ever. It is also not because someone drinks or because someone's in active substance use. It's not because a perpetrator has mental illness. All of those absolutely could trigger the violence and make it worse, but they are not the reason for the violence. Those who abuse, they make that choice. They do it because they can, and they do it because it works to get what they want. Who are the victims? Literally everyone. Across the spectrum of everyone that we see, there is no one that cannot be a victim of domestic violence. Old, young, male, female, trans, non-binary. We see this. We see it here in West Virginia. Absolutely. The abuse affects folks' ability to get and keep a job, maintain contacts with friends and family, and that's on purpose. So folks don't have a support system, and we'll talk more about that. But all of these things are done on purpose, and they absolutely do have a long-term effect on survivors, physically and emotionally. And the perpetrators, same as with the victims and survivors. Old, young, male, female, gay, straight, anywhere in between. They may have been abused by children, or they may have witnessed abuse, or they absolutely may not. But there is a pattern of jealous and controlling behavior with the goal of isolating and threatening and frightening their partner to get what they want. They see their partner as the absolute central, like the center of their being, and they are also property. Their partners are seen as property. And they can be violent only within the abusive relationship. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well as we move forward. My number one takeaway here when we start out, and I can't say this enough, and we witness it all of the time. Abusers and perpetrators absolutely groom everyone around them, not just their victim. That's why it makes it so incredibly difficult when many victims and survivors come forward, especially if their abuser is well known or well liked, or she starts talking about the abuse and immediately that abuse is minimized because, oh, I know Doug. I worked with him. He's a great guy. Well, he may be a great guy if you're working with him and he's bringing you copies that you just made at the copier. But if you're in a relationship with Doug, that's a different Doug. And it's something that I don't think enough people absolutely understand, that being in a relationship with somebody who's abusive is not the same as, oh, I know him from work. He's a great guy. Or, that's my uncle's cousin. He's always great with his kids. Those are the sort of things that minimize what a victim has actually gone through. So if someone tells you that they have been physically, emotionally, sexually assaulted, please do your best to try not to minimize by saying, oh yeah, I knew that guy. He's a great guy. Abusers want people to look at their victim like they're absolutely crazy. They're perpetrators are absolutely charming and helpful. It feeds into making sure that their victims are never believed. So I talked a little bit about it earlier, and power and control, that truly is what it's all about. Physical violence is the most typical form of abuse. It's the go-to that people think about. But victims actually have to deal with so many types of abuse at the hands of their partners. Sexual coercion and sexual assault are frequently part of that dynamic of a violent relationship. And also, the power and control tactics that we're going to talk about next are the common experiences by many victims in relationship violence, and they're used by perpetrators to maintain power and control. Isolation, threats, humiliation, and physical abuse. They are the weapons of coercive control, and it's absolutely used to develop a relationship where, I guess it's best often described as, I'm always walking around on eggshells. I don't know what's going to happen next. We all know a relationship should involve loving support, but many of those that start out with the love bombing and the, you were the best thing that's ever happened to me, end up being a trap. So I'm I want everyone to have a copy of this power and control wheel. So I'm actually, when I send the PowerPoint, I'm going to send this separately. And I'm going to send a few other wheels that we use as well. And I'm looking to my right because I had one printed out, but I have a few of these. And as to how they relate in different areas of society. So I will share these as well. But as you can see, it's all about economic abuse, coercion and threats, intimidation. The male privilege very much we touch on this in a little bit, but it's about, there are still a lot of folks out there that is, well, men that will say, you know what, I'm the head of the household. What I say goes. And that's absolutely changing. It's changed more in probably 30 years than it had in 200, but it still happens. And that's absolutely part of just one of the linchpins of domestic violence. It's a very small thing, but it leads to bigger control issues. So if you're a victim of coercive control, you feel like you're being held hostage. You're constantly being asked, where were you? What are you doing? Who are you talking to? You're often criticized, like nothing you do is right. Stalking in this day and age is incredibly easy. You know, it used to be you'd have to drop by somebody's house. Now and technology has made it so easy for perpetrators to stalk their victims, and the judicial system has not caught up with that. And that's incredibly distressing. And after a point in time, it seems routine. Like victims absolutely go, well, this is my life. They blame themselves. They're constantly questioning themselves. And that is not by accident. That is by design. It's easy for a person in a relationship like this to lose confidence in what they believe themselves to be and accept their partner's view of what their joint reality is. They're told again and again that they are responsible for their partner's behavior. And if they wouldn't have been so mouthy, or if they just would have cleaned up, or, you know, if dinner was ready when he got home, this wouldn't be happening. And at the same time, the best thing that they can do to get through from day to day is to keep the peace. So they learn to just put a cork on what they want, absolutely silence their voices. They know that they are going to hear from loved ones that, as we say, you know, why didn't she just leave? But you are, one of the really important things is to understand how this control starts. You have a person who is both telling you quite often that you're the most amazing thing that's ever happened to them, and they love you so much, and you're so important to them, but also maybe even within the same conversation, you're horrible and you're triggering them. And if you had just done this and this and this differently, and you're a horrible person and you're ugly. So you're getting those mixed messages. And after a long part of time, mix of time, you actually start to question, like, which one is it? Am I this horrible person that deserves this? Or, does he love me? So it's incredibly confusing. So we want to talk about what coercive control looks like. Economic abuse. We see it absolutely all of the time. And this is part also where some of that male privilege comes in, because there were times when it was expected that the man takes care of all of the money and the finances. So it's very easy to slip into that, like not having control of your own money. But what we also see is a larger issue where victims and survivors are not allowed to get a job. If they get a job, their jobs are sabotaged by either him showing up all of the time or making sure that she's late, so she ends up getting fired. It's so much easier to control somebody if they're under your thumb, like literally where you are. So many workplaces, I see so many women that have been fired from their jobs because the abuser, if he's this type of abuser and doesn't care to come in and make a scene, will absolutely come make a scene, frighten coworkers, and then the supervisor, has people coming to him saying, she's the problem because she's why he's coming here. And it's really unfortunate because she's not the problem, he's the problem. But what do you do about that? And so we see people lose jobs all of the time. And then we see if victims are allowed to work, their partner they're not allowed to have access to their own money. So we have seen it's actually fairly common for survivors that we serve in shelter to have never been allowed to have a job, never had a checking account, don't know how a debit card works. And some of these women have been with their abusers, they're in their 30s quite often, and they've been with their abuser since they were teenagers. So they have no idea what it looks like to be self-sufficient, not because they didn't want to, but just because they weren't allowed to. Coercion and threats. The coercion is it's almost an everyday thing. They're going to threaten to harm the victim. But here's the other thing. Quite often, they're not going to harm necessarily just the victim. They're going to harm the children, the pets, the family members. I worked at corrections and I saw many, many cases of domestic violence where the victim and then now survivor had been allowed to live, but the perpetrator killed her parents or killed her sister. It happens way more often than people understand because it's much more painful to perhaps lose your parents and then have to deal with that. Also, bystanders, if they try to intervene, it's incredibly dangerous as well. So they're forced to engage in things against their will. If they're undocumented, absolutely, I'm going to call immigration, the Internal Revenue Service. But the number one thing we see, overarching, if the victim has a child, the threat of using child protective services is the number one thing. And unfortunately, what we see, the dynamic between CPS and victims, is that if CPS gets involved and there's domestic violence in the home, what we often see, and this is very broad overarching. So if we've got CPS workers here, this is just what we wish you would understand. This is not to blame. But when CPS gets involved, the onus seems to automatically go to the mother. Why aren't you keeping your kids safe? You need to leave. And a lot of times, if the victims don't leave right then or within a certain period of time, then we move in to take the kids. So what that means is that the mother and her children are now essentially and oftentimes homeless, and they have to lose everything. And now there's an open CPS case where the victim's being held responsible for his behavior and loses everything, has to come to shelter. And meanwhile, the perpetrator, there are no charges pending. He's sitting at home, and he may or may, and often they may not even be his kids. So, of course he doesn't want visitation. Like there's no plan for him. And the onus is not on him to keep his kids safe. it's on her. And we see that all of the time. For instance, and this is not a one-off story. We had a young woman who had actually, before CPS even got involved, had been actively fleeing from the northern part of the state. She wanted to come here because she knew that distance was going to make the absolute difference. And now these dates are just completely random. I'm going to throw it out there. So CPS had come to the house. Her plan was to come to us on, let's say, Friday, April 25th, because she knew he had to work a midnight. So she had been, over the past months, getting bags together, clothes and everything she needed. And she was leaving on that Friday. We had beds ready for her. Like, we had been working on a plan with her. We had also, so then CPS gets involved at some point during this process, within those like 3 months that she was planning this. And they knew she was leaving on the 25th, the Friday. And we had been in contact with her CPS worker and said, yes, this is absolutely happening. We have beds for her. We have transportation set up. Like, we're ready. And the sheriffs and CPS show up on Thursday before she leaves, and they take the kids. And it took her 2 years to get her children back. And they were placed not in family foster care, but in foster care. And we see it happen quite often, which is why I bring it up. And so I'd love to move forward. We do go in and we talk with CPS workers. We do trainings. And I absolutely understand that these homes absolutely aren't safe. But for us, I'd love to see more accountability to the perpetrator, or at least equal accountability on the perpetrator as what's placed on the victim. So that was my little tangent. So, but it's just so incredibly important. Intimidation, it's happening every day. If you've not been in a domestic violence situation, then you don't know what a look can do. You know, my mother had a look, but it worked for her, so he will destroy property in front of her. There are menacing looks or expressions. Will threaten to kill the family pet or possibly kill the family pet in front of you. We absolutely have had that happen. A perpetrator killed a family pet on FaceTime because the victim wouldn't leave the shelter and come home. There's a lot of displaying of weapons as a mean of control. And this next one, I know we're in West Virginia, and I know folks love their guns. But this is absolutely a provable statistic. If I'm sure everybody's got their phones in front of them, you can run and Google. Having a firearm in the home where there is also domestic violence increases the likelihood of somebody being killed by 500%. We see it every year. Every year. If there is an active DVP, folks do have a domestic violence petition. Folks are asked to turn their guns over. And I think a lot of people think that those guns are turned over to law enforcement, and they absolutely aren't. They're turned over to their mom. They're turned over to their dad. They're turned over to their neighbor. And it's absolutely, they're supposed to do it, but they're not being turned over to law enforcement. So depending on what that dynamic is between the mom, the dad, the neighbor, there's absolutely a chance of a perpetrator having absolute access to the guns that they are supposed to have turned over. Emotional abuse, absolutely real. The effects of this are as long lasting, if not longer, than physical abuse. The perpetrator works to convince the victims that they're crazy, they're irrational, doubts their beliefs and their experiences. And I know we throw around gaslighting a lot, but it absolutely happens. It's absolutely real. I know that we as women get called crazy all the time. And it is in a domestic violence situation, it's absolutely just another tool. It's the constant criticism, it's the insults, and this isn't just an occasional argument. It's a continual humiliation and degradation, and it's on purpose to wear away self-esteem. Perpetrators love to isolate victims from anyone that could possibly help them. They're not allowed to leave home, and you'll know you're in a domestic violence situation, or if you're trying to be isolated, if you're on the phone talking to your sister. I know nobody talks on the phone like this anymore, but I'm old, so I still do. So you're on the phone talking to your sister and your partner comes home. And if you automatically have to go, oh, okay, John's home, I gotta go. And you can't continue to have that conversation with your sister, there's something wrong with that. 100%. So that's just one little thing that, to think about. Like if you're whatever you're doing has to stop because he's now home and it's the John show, that is absolutely not normal. And the goal of this is to cut people off from anybody who's going to intervene and help her. 100%. They don't want you to have somebody to go to. And COVID did the abuser's job for them. When we had when you couldn't stay-at-home order, that was it. The stay-at-home order, home's not a safe place for a lot of people. Home's not a safe place for a lot of kids. The first idea that we get that there's something going wrong in a household is kids being at school. So COVID really made it much more difficult for survivors to reach out. And that's why we developed a 24/7 hotline chat, because we realized it's really hard to have a phone call about your abuse with your abuser in the next room. So that's one of the things that we have changed since COVID started as a way to make it safe for people to reach out. They're going to minimize, they're going to deny, and they're going to blame. This is people go, well, why didn't you just call the police? This is no fault of the police, but the police end up showing up, sometimes 15, 20 times. And at some point, if they don't make an arrest, the perpetrator then uses that to go, oh, you're going to call the police again? Because, they didn't believe your crazy self last time. You're really going to do that? Or law enforcement will show up, and they've been there 15, 20 times, and they will go, okay, we don't know what's happening, but we've been here 15 times before. Either you two get it together or you're both going in. That happens absolutely all of the time because, they both start telling the same story, and it's hard to assess who the true perpetrator is. And then quite often the victim absolutely will take responsibility for some of that abuse. Well, yeah, he was drinking and I knew not to talk to him like that when he was drinking. And it makes it so much harder. So we talked about using control through pets and self-harm, threaten to kill themselves. They're going to say, if you leave, you abandon the kids, I'm going to take them. And the victim can be made to feel guilty for breaking up the family. A couple other things to add on to this that we see specifically in people of color. In West Virginia, the number of Black and brown men in prison is, as we know, it's 3% of the population, but more than 40% incarcerated. It's probably even higher than that. So in communities of color, we sometimes see that women of color don't want to be responsible for, or are made to feel responsible for, sending another Black or brown man to prison. And then also we see in communities of faith that women are told they need to stay. that they need to see their pastor for counseling, but it is absolutely her job to be his helpmeet. Like, you cannot divorce. So those make it even more difficult to leave. And we talked about male privilege. So in the beginning, I'm skipping over this one because even though I'm talking fast, I don't want to keep everybody tracked. So I am the old person that, yes, absolutely. It was supposed to be a gift and Tom Cruise was supposed to move. He's not my favorite person, but I do love the help me help you. So are there any questions, Mary or Sarah?
I see there's a comment.
Okay.
That says something that needs to be discussed is apartments may have something called in the lease if the police is called for a domestic disturbance that you can be evicted. This
Yes.
was in my lease when I was living in Kentucky.
Absolutely. So they're called nuisance laws. And there are, let me tell you, so Charleston doesn't have them yet. And they are, so we know, I've also dealt with housing, like housing's my jam too. And so I know that there are pockets of this state that are absolutely not necessarily not renter friendly, but they are definitely not housing friendly. So they're called nuisance clauses in the lease, and sometimes they're built into city code and sometimes they aren't, but they're still enforced, and I'm not sure how, but they say, so the proponents of this, they say that the reason for it is for those drug houses. So if you, let's say you've got the police called on you 10 times because you're running drugs out of the house. So that's originally what these nuisance clauses in the leases started for. But the unintended consequences of those are, if you're in a domestic violence relationship and the police show up, more than twice, literally, then you are considered a nuisance. And so it goes as far as the landlord can evict you to, I've seen some city and, well, it's mostly city codes that then say, no, the city's going to take that choice out of the landlord's hand. And if you are a nuisance neighbor, you must be evicted, whether the landlord wants you to or not. So that absolutely affects survivors. And I love that. Thank you for bringing that up, because I don't think a lot of people realize that. There are a lot of unintended consequences to what some folks think are great ideas.
So there's a couple other comments in the chat. The one person says, the best way to support the victim when they go back to the abuse, best way to support the victim when they go back to the abuser because she's afraid of losing the kids or having to share custody. I guess they want to know the best way to support the victim when they go back because they're afraid of those things.
The best way to support is understand, absolutely, be understanding and be there to listen. And I know that is so incredibly hard. But understanding that his goal is to isolate and make sure she has nobody to go to. If you're that person that, even though you're frustrated and you're like, what are we supposed to do here? The best thing is to support, be there and be that sense of support. And absolutely, don't ask those questions about why don't you leave, because she's just, I'm sure she hears it all of the time. The other thing, though, is for those of you in West Virginia, and I don't know if everybody's in West Virginia.
A fair amount are, but sometimes we have people from, most of this.
Okay, great. So it's fairly new into law over the last couple of years, where West Virginia is now a 50-50, supposed to be no questions asked, 50-50 custody, except in the cases of domestic violence. So the other way to support her is to really take a look at the law, referrals to legal aid. Like if she's truly, I'm not leaving because we're going to share custody. If there is a history of domestic violence, that automatically calls into question that 50-50 custody. Now, and that's also on the best day, because what we're seeing sometimes happen, and I hate to be a Debbie Downer about this because it seems like, oh great, they've made arrangements for that. But we have a case right now with a survivor that we're helping. There's a long history of domestic violence. There's a child involved, and even though there is the history of domestic violence, the family court judge said, no, there isn't. So she is indeed sharing 50-50 custody with her abuser, because the judge, do not ask me how that happens, because I will never understand, but the judge absolutely said, no, that's not domestic violence, because he only shoved her once. Every other bit of control was, he never hit the baby and he only shoved you once. So that's not domestic violence. She had no access to her money and couldn't leave, and yeah, and all of that. But yes, so it's sort of a know that she could have help, but also understand that worst case scenario, a judge may flagrantly just say that's not the case.
So that sort of leads to I'm going to skip ahead because there's a follow-up question that I think relates to that. Someone was asking, does there need to be proof of the domestic violence for that 50-50
So
to be altered?
Normally, I would say no, but now that I've seen it in action, absolutely. At the very least, a domestic violence, well, not at the very least, either pictures, recordings, things like that. And some judges may want absolutely to see that you have applied for a domestic violence protective order. There are so many reasons that people don't do that, and I fully support it, because it does very often amp up that danger. But yes, it probably would be best if there absolutely was rock solid proof.
And there's a comment that says, in Virginia, emotional abuse is not considered because of not considered domestic violence because of not having proof. And they hope that law can be changed.
Yes, absolutely. And like I said, we see the longest. So there's a specific type of post-traumatic stress disorder called CPTSD. And that is an effect of emotional abuse.
Somebody else commented that it's hard to prove emotional abuse as master manipulators want the abuse to be unseen.
100%, absolutely. And absolutely is. Totally agree.
There's another comment. I don't know if this is a question or maybe they're asking for suggestions, and if so, you can chime in. But they said, I have a situation where, in addition to threats against the pets in the home, there are threats that if you don't do X, Y, Z, or do A, B, and C, then the perpetrator will kill himself. And the individual, the woman, is so beat down that she believes she needs him to survive.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, that is. Oh, sorry, hold on. My computer's doing something. Absolutely the case. We see that all of the time. And so if that person is local, one of the things that we offer is counseling and support group. It's a great first step for people who they know they want to leave, or they aren't sure they want to leave, or they don't know how to leave, support group and counseling is a great first step. And even if you're not local, almost all of our sister domestic violence providers have some form of counseling and definitely have support group. Listen, it's scary if that's your only life. And especially if he has all of that financial control. I mean, it's expensive to live. You know, I'm right there with everybody. Like, I get it. And it's, you know, it's unfortunate because when a victim leaves, she quite often has to lose everything. And it shouldn't be that way, you know. And who wants to lose everything they've worked for?
So, let me see, I don't see any additional questions, but I was wondering if you might be able to just kind of give maybe like a 2 or 3 bullet summary of, you know, if you are in practice, right, and you encounter a woman or whoever is experiencing domestic violence, you know, what are sort of the highlights of best practices for responding to them in sort of that moment that you become aware or as you learn about?
Okay, so the absolute first thing that I would love to see everyone say is, I believe you. Are you safe? And then the next step is to make sure you have your local providers. We say hotline number, but that doesn't mean, I don't want the folks thinking they can't reach out to their local providers, victim service providers, with questions, or just to say, hey, when my friend's ready to leave, what should I do? So the second thing is, I'd like for everyone to know who their local provider is and have their number. And a lot of us have online chats, have that ready as well. And then, so I believe you, have resources ready. And the third thing is to say, if you're willing to do this, to say, when you're ready to go, I will help you. And that may be one night of keeping them safe until they can get in a shelter, because sometimes distance does matter. We have a lot of people that we're going to shelter for a night, but then we're going to move them on. We're going to send them to Morgantown. We're going to work with Epic in the Eastern Panhandle. So, you know, if you want to help, be ready to maybe keep somebody safe for a day until they can get to professionals that can help. It truly is. It's really that simple. Just saying, I believe you.
That's great.
Yeah.
There's one more question. I think we have time for this last question in the chat, and then we're going to have to stop. But what are some other options when domestic violence shelters are full? I have been told when reporting with a client that there is nothing else that can be done.
So we are full almost all of the time, but we often go over capacity if we have to. This is now being recorded, so I hope the fire marshal never watches this.
We can edit this out.
Yeah, like Julie's now busted and shut down. There are often, though not all of the time, but especially here in West Virginia, there are ways that we can secure some funding to put people in hotels for short stays. We have done that. The problem is, in a lot of rural areas, there are no hotels. But I think it's a conversation about saying, okay, I understand you're full, but are you overly full? And could you, it's absolutely, like, as social workers and as advocates, I urge you to say to the person that you're talking to, okay, so everything here is full, but could you help facilitate a referral to Marietta, Ohio, somewhere quick and over, you know, depending on where you are, or Ashland, Kentucky, until you get a room open. And so we do that quite often. We'll say, usually what we're able to do is just refer locally, Huntington, Putnam County, Beckley. And what we'll say is, listen, we're going to bring them back. We will take them back, but if you can house them briefly until we can get something open up. But unfortunately, it's true. A lot of us are full quite often. And it has to be said, I run a very low barrier shelter. They don't have to be clean. They don't, we're very much, we embrace harm reduction. We're not going to let someone use or bring drugs or alcohol into the shelter, but we're very much like, you don't have to be sober to be there. But there are a lot of shelters that are. There are shelters that we will take pets. There are a lot of shelters that won't take pets. So some of those, there are still some larger barrier shelters that are being operated. And so that's a question that also leads to, like, are you really full?
Yeah. So thank you, Julie. We are going to have to stop. One quick thing. Somebody was asking for your contact information. So if you're willing to maybe put your email in the chat, that might be a way to. Yeah. Yep. So while you're doing that, I want to thank everybody for coming today. I want to thank Julie for your presentation. This was super informative and really important topic. So thank you. I did post a link to the evaluation survey in the chat for folks. So if you want to take a minute and complete that.
I would love that.
Yes. And I think that's it. We will send out a copy of the PowerPoint, and please stay tuned for additional Lunch and Learn